And I've seen that when I was working at Melbourne Business School for 20 years with Rob Burke. We would run these courses for CFOs and CFOs. They would say, oh, data matters. Then they'd switch straight away to metaphor. And I said, well, you spent the last 5 minutes convincing me that data matters, but 50% of your sentences were stories.
Welcome to Futures Workshop, episode 3. We're back into the interviews this week. New guest and new tool, and same host, Victoria Mulligan in Auckland, New Zealand. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm excited. I'm really excited to share our interview with Sohail Inayatullah. Can you give us a bit of your background with him?
Sure. So Sohail I met a few years ago down at a masterclass in Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand. He was one of my first teachers, really, in futures thinking and futures tools. So I'm really excited to have him on the show and share a little bit about how he teaches, how he shares his methods.
Yeah, and you've stayed in touch with him. In fact, hosted him just recently back in New Zealand.
We had him and Ivana Milosevic, who we will get to speak to later in the series, in Auckland just last month. We had them running a public masterclass on strategy formation and futures thinking for people locally.
And all the guests in season 1 of our Futures Workshop are big deals, but, well, he's one of the biggest.
Yeah, so he is actually considered widely to be one of the most influential and important futurists of our time. He's listed in the top 2% of scientists globally, and really known for his significant impact on future studies. So throughout his very long career, he has defined methodologies, he's created frameworks, developed tools, and they continue to shape the way that individuals and organisations around the world think about the future. He is also the first UNESCO chair in future studies. His expertise takes him around the globe almost on a weekly basis, advising organisations, governments and their leaders on how to think more meaningfully about what lies ahead.
Yeah, and what I like about that is that often people who work around the world are quite coy about who they've worked with, quite reluctant to share specifics, but he is great in that he can pull out anecdotes and examples from around the world to illustrate his point. That's one of the things I'm most excited about sharing today. We'll let him introduce the tool, but anything you want to say to sort of prep people for it?
Well, the tool that we will be talking about is Causal Layered Analysis. Like you said, I won't go into the detail of it. We'll leave that to Sohail, but it really is a fundamental tool in how we carry out strategic planning, future studies and forecasting to more effectively model the future. So he developed the tool in the early 90s to move beyond sort of that traditional forecasting technique, which too often focuses on surface level trends and data. So CLA, Causal Layered Analysis, on the other hand, helps to gain a deeper understanding of underlying causes and stories that shape our view of the future. There's nothing really quite like it.
What did you enjoy most about this conversation?
Oh, so much. Sohail has a wonderful ability to be able to distill these complex theoretical issues into really clear, actionable sound bites, insights that draw on examples which, like you said, they almost feel too wild to be real. He has the best stories. And he can move between examples of advising prime ministers, Interpol, or even Olympians to what it takes to apply CLA to the self and why that's so important too.
Yeah, he's got a great ability to speak at a very high level and also at a very practical level.
Yep, he's not just that brilliant mind. He's also this really beautifully grounded, open and joyful human really to engage with. And it is always a privilege and so inspiring to speak with him about the ideas, the strategies that have defined and actually that continue to define his career. And how, they can inspire us to think about the future in new and better ways.
Well, thank you for all the feedback on episode 1 and 2, which have been coming in over the last few weeks. We hope you enjoy this interview just as much. Here's our conversation with Sohail Inayatullah.
Welcome to the Futures Workshop.
Great to be here.
Looking forward to talking to you about your experiences using futures and foresight tools and methodologies. Can you tell us a little bit about the tool that you want to focus on today?
I think today the idea is to focus on CLA, both as a tool to deconstruct and also as a tool to reconstruct. CLA stands for Causal Layered Analysis. And the idea is there's a data superficial level called the litany. Underneath that is the system, whether it's society, technology, economy, environment, polity. Underneath that is a worldview, a mindset, a way of thinking. And underneath that is an unconscious metaphor or myth. So CLA assumes 4 levels of reality.
Is the implication of that we perhaps spend too much time on just that first layer in the course of day-to-day life?
Whether it's time spent poorly or wisely is a second question. I know most governments love the issue of, to stay at the litany level. Problem, let's have a simple solution. So often for governments, it's training. So there's a crisis in the medical system, and so what do? Let's just train doctors. There's a crisis in transport. What do? Let's just build more roads. So generally, litany level is easy. It's easy to see. The political response is palatable. We can get widespread agreement. However, the challenge is we know from transportation studies, more roads work, but after 7 to 10 years, congestion comes back because people change their driving behavior. CLA suggests if you only stay at the data level or the system level, you'll keep on getting the same problems. So then you have to go deeper. What's the worldview? Is it the big city outlook? Is it the metaphor of car as king? I know when we were working with the Singapore government many years ago, they said, car as king, let's put the crown underneath of the citizen. And they changed the metaphor to everything within reachable distance, everything within reach. Now, if that's your new narrative, then it's not just about more roads. It's how do we provide solutions to citizens' mobility needs. So this is why CLA is powerful. It changes the paradigm and finds novel solutions. If we don't do that, we'll get solutions, but they may not work over time.
For the listeners who haven't seen a visual of the CLA, I think it's quite useful to talk about that we see it visualized as an iceberg. Is that right?
Well, this is a debate. So when I was presenting to Fuji Xerox in Australia 20 years ago, one of the participants said, it's an iceberg. And I said, fantastic. Now, 15 years later, someone said, no, it's actually chocolate cake. And I go, what? What do you mean? He goes, well, every layer has value. If you only change the story without changing the new litany, how we count things, we get the same stuff. So people say, okay, we have GDP today. Let's move towards well-being. So we had a project with New Zealand government a few years ago from GDP to well-being. But if you don't recount, if the new litany is still GDP, then it doesn't matter. So we have to have a new way of counting. So they suggested iceberg is great, but what's better is a 4-layer cake. And I'm like, okay, whatever works.
I like that. So can you take us right back to the beginning maybe with this one? So where did causal layered analysis come from? What was the problem that it was designed to solve?
Well, at the personal level, I grew up, my father worked with the United Nations as a researcher in New York, Geneva, and Malaysia. And when he would come home, from little kids, we would have these long discussions. Me just trying to keep up with him. But it became very clear that international systems stay at the litany level because their main worldview is geopolitics. The system is how nation states work and think, and the metaphor is basically safety within, Wild West outside. So going to these meetings as a young person, listening to this stuff, I could see, and later as I started to attend conferences myself, I could see, well, there's some people who are data-driven. Their thing is, they would give long lectures on the quantitative data to convince you. Other people were systems-driven. They said, well, it's not just the data. We have to link infrastructure planning with nature. If you work in biosecurity, it's not just finding cures to new zoonotic diseases. It's ensuring there's buffer zones between humans and wild nature. So they said systems are the key. Then I would go to other conferences and philosophers would talk endlessly about the nature of the mind. It's epistemic. It's paradigm. I thought, oh my God, there's another group. And the data gang would stare at the paradigm gang and say, you guys are just crazy. There's no such thing as a paradigm. Show me the money. Show me the numbers. And then when I would work in Asia, argumentation that was most successful wasn't based on data. It was based on who had the best story. It always came down to a mythology, a metaphor. And I've seen that when I was working at Melbourne Business School for 20 years with Rob Burke. We would run these courses for CFOs and CFOs. They would say, oh, data doesn't matter. I mean, they would say data matters, then they'd switch straight away to metaphor. Huh. And I said, well, you spend the last 5 minutes convincing me that data matters, but 50% of your sentences were stories.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And then they would look at me, and there was this kind of cognitive dissonance. They go, aha. And so the research we've seen is when people have to decide, if you give them decisions to make, and you show them data and you show them story, they eventually decide on story, but claim they decide based on the evidence that was given to them. And it takes unpacking to go deeper. I think 20 years ago, I was working for Sunshine Coast Health Partnership. And so I was working with the general practitioners, and we were looking at alternative futures of general practitioner, going from the doctor knows it all to the multi-health center to listen to the patient. And one of the doctors said, yeah, I want to listen to the patient, but many times the patient has the wrong story. I said, what do you mean? He said, I get people who want a new knee. And I said to them, yes, we can't operate until you lose 40, 50 kilos. And then they look at him and say, oh, but Joe said she'll be right. And I said, who's Joe? He said, Joe was the premier during the 70s in Queensland. And it was a notion that Joe said, don't worry about it, do what you want. It will be taken care of you. Now they're in their own 70s and 80s, and the doctor says, well, actually, I can't take care of you. You had the wrong story. So this much of our work in futures is it ambulance at the bottom of the hill or fence at the top? So foresight work is really about convincing people to change the world. If I wish to do that, I have to certainly present evidence based on which diseases are problematic, but I also have to give stories. So when I was working in Mongolia, for example, WHO had us intervene on the health system. And so we had 4 working groups. And the working group I remember the most was the one in charge of gastric cancer. And they said more than 1,000 cases are newly diagnosed. I said, okay, why? Level 2, the system. They said poor dietary habits, poor quality foods, high alcohol, tobacco consumption. Okay, so then you think, okay, we need to intervene in that, get better food, have, challenge tobacco consumption. And I said, but why is that? They go, well, actually, our problem is we've gone from a social era, fewer choices, structured, to a capitalist era, market view, where there's endless choices. So I said, well, why is that causing more gastric cancer? He said, our story. I said, what's the story? And they gave me a Mongolian sentence. When they translated it, it said, whether you eat from the can or the carrot, it does not matter. It's your choice. And so then it became clear gastric cancer is increasing because they've gone from collective responsibility to individual responsibility, as well as this shift where fewer health foods are available because of market trends. So this is where CLA was powerful. Then I said, okay, we're here because we want a better Mongolia, right? We're not here to sell more particular types of food. It's national health at first. So I asked the health leaders, and luckily, we were lucky. We had the 20, 30 top leaders in the country in the room. I said, what's a better story? And one of them in Mongolian said, your stomach is not a garbage bin. And suddenly everyone understood. And the second one was, take a healthy bite. If you're going to have junk food, we get that, but you take a little bit. And then I said, so what's the better new worldview? Well, we've entered this market world. It's market world with social responsibility, not just market. And I said, what are we going to do differently? Well, they said, well, the federal government can tax harmful foods and it can subsidize healthy foods. And I said, so what's going to be the key KPI? Well, KPI, we're going to measure gastric cancer, numbers, levels, etc. So if you can see, it was double. Yes, we need a new story, but we also have to have real strategies that emerge from the story. So what emerged for me the last, developing CLA, was always to link a new story with a new strategy and a new measurement system. If I don't do that, then the story just becomes empty words. If I just keep the old KPIs, everyone knows they don't matter. When I was working full-time at universities, I remember one vice chancellor said, as academics, you should all cooperate. I said, okay, beautiful. And then we looked at his KPI. The more I cooperate with my colleagues, the less research funds I get. So I said, okay, he's saying cooperative, but he's measuring KPIs that are based on competition. So everyone knows, aha, that story is false. And the story has to be compelling. We were working with the Thai Institute for Justice, Ivana Milic and I, in September, I believe. And there was many great CLAs, but the one I remember the most was about the current politics, the polarization. And they said, we live in drama land. It's a big theater between the political parties. And I said, okay, I get that. So where do you want to go? And if you know, Thailand is generally a Buddhist country. They said, we want to move to Dharma land. And everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. Morality, social justice, protect the weak, innovating green technologies, educational reform. They was really make this shift and live out the key principles that they were born with. But there's this cognitive dissonance. We're supposed to be in Dharma, but we're always in drama. How do we make that shift? So this is where CLA to me has legs, to use a metaphor. It speaks to people's inner world, the heart, and it speaks to all of us who, of course, live in a world where quantitative measures matter.
And I love the metaphor of giving CLA legs. That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm interested, though, these are challenging conversations that you're having and stories that are being told. How do you set that up for success? So how, when you're coming into the room and you know you're doing a CLA with a diverse set of leaders or otherwise, how are you priming them? How are you getting them ready?
So one is the unconscious level, and this might sound strange, but I'm very clear groups I want to work with have already figured out their current strategies aren't working. They want management consultants, efficiency experts. There's brilliant people who do that. They should get them. So I tell them straight away, if you want our work, please don't waste our time or your time. It's really not going to work. So the phase one is that inner work. I was working with one national law enforcement in one country, and they said, we are working on the future of law enforcement. I said, great. And so they sent me two of their detectives, and we talked. I said, before we start the project, I need to know if this is going to make sense, because they sent me 40, 50 pages, 10 documents to read. And I said, I'm not going to read the documents. They said, yeah, but you need to know things about us. So I said, that's not how I know the world. Every organization has endless documents they wish for me to read. And I work in a world of meta patterns. And they said, okay, so let's talk about that. So I asked them, as a story, what's going on? They said, aha, we're at the beach. There's a tsunami of organized crime coming. We're going to be inundated. I said, okay, so who are you? He said, well, I want to take them to safe ground so we can meet the needs of our citizens better. I said, great, I get that. That doesn't tell me who you are, because I'm going to work with you. And the senior detective said, aha, I get it. I'm the machete wielder. I'm going to cut the trees to make a path to safety. And then her colleague there, who was a senior advisor, she goes, I'm the white witch. And of course, they're not going to say that when they're meeting with all their law enforcement colleagues, because that sounds kind of weird, right? You don't want to admit, you're a. And then I said, what does that mean? He goes, I'm whispering strategy to the leaders so we can move forward. So now we have it set up where there's an understanding the power of story, and also very clearly how we have to protect people in harm's way. Now then, as we went further, they said, well, our organization is very conservative. We're law enforcement. And law enforcement is merit-based, how many years you worked. And then I said, so actually taking them to safety won't work, will it? They won't want to go that far. They live in a world where the appropriate hormones are released when they solve the problem today. They don't live in a world where prevention is actually validated. right? It's solving today's crime, not preventing tomorrow's crime. So then I said, then they said, we need a halfway place. We can't get to the top of the hill. That won't make any sense to them. They won't even believe us. But is there a halfway place that we can take them? And that's the project was not about the year 2040. It was about 2025. How do we get law enforcement to better understand the challenges coming from cybercrime, etc.? So this was workable. So the priming is getting the champion to understand their story, me to understand my role, and then getting them to take a bit of a risk around going to depth strategy. If I can do that, then we're in good shape.
So Sohail, you talked a little bit around going from the litany or from the data, the headlines, and you're getting into the storytelling, the myths, the metaphors. What next? So how do you move them back up the chocolate cake or the iceberg to measurements that matter?
So once we've figured out the current story is not working, right? What's the better story? And then once we've done that, we have the new metaphor, then we go into systems thinking. So for example, I've been working with the energy sector for 10, 15 years. The old story was keep the lights on at the lowest cost, right? Mm-hmm. That's it. The new story was, wait a second, we're entering a world where customers are not just consuming energy, they're producing energy. So energy is now decentralized and integrated. What's my role as an energy provider? They said, I'm the connector. I'm connecting the home with the grid, a very different role. So then I asked them, okay, if you're going to be the connector, do you have the correct roles, the correct job categories? What has to change systemically? They said, okay, HR has to attract not just engineers, but we have to create a platform where we can help customers and producers who are connecting through solar to the grid. It's a whole different value proposition. So now what are we measuring? Of course, we're still measuring keep the lights on, but we're also measuring the number of people who are producing energy. Now, once they get that, then some of the ones who are the innovators say, by 2035, we're not the connectors. We're helping individuals choose their own energy adventure. So we're going from a fixed system, fossil fuel, to a far more fluid system, to eventually a personalized energy system. Now that's harder to measure, but it's essentially far more collaboration with retailers, a decentralized ecosystem. So this is where every group, once they get the metaphor, we ask them, bring in the systems people. And that's where they're really useful. I don't discount systems people, worldview people, or metaphor people, or data people. It's just finding the right space and time for them to add their value.
It feels like you've got the design thinking people in there as well. Is that right?
Yeah, they would help a lot, certainly.
Mm. And so at each of those levels, you're putting metrics against it to speak to the needs of people who need the data as well as the people that need the storytelling?
Yeah. I mean, I remember I was running one workshop in Bangkok with international development agencies. And I mean, the first bit, they're all staring at you, right? What do you mean? We have to be transparent. We have to be accountable. We write these long reports to our donor agencies, how we spent every dollar, right? So it's a quantitative game. And then one of the leaders stood up and said, actually, I have to be honest. Every meeting I go to, I spend 6 months preparing the project plan. In the board of directors meeting, it's always the one who has the better metaphor gets the funding. Mm. So he said what he's learned is to, of course, do the project plan, but he has to be able to understand the deeper unconscious mythology and story. And once he or she can do that, then of course the goal is efficacy. If that case, getting the right water projects or sewage projects or food projects to the right people in need.
So it doesn't sound like you're short of stories or case studies where you've used that CLA. How has it evolved? How have you changed it? How have you switched it up, given an audience? How's it evolved?
Well, I think for me in the beginning, I would have been deconstruction more, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the problem with the health system. Doctor knows best. And what are the stakeholders? The patient says, listen to me. Pharmaceuticals say, hey, I have a drug for you. And now more and more I move to the solution space. What's the alternative future across time? And the next part of the course is the CLA of the self. So we're working with the Pacific community. They came up with this wonderful metaphor, a vaka of I think a flotilla of vakas, or a vaka of, yeah. So it's a flotilla of canoes, right? Of vakas. So that's who we are, not just nation states. Let's talk about our organization, not just in UN language, but in story language. So that's done. Then the next part is, okay, who are you in that story? And I learned that 20 years ago. I've used that story before, where I was working with a government agency, and their metaphor was Cinderella. And I said, so what does that mean? They go, well, we're always waiting for Prince Charming. I said, who's that? Government funding. Okay. And so then the project became, what are 4 different scenarios of government funding? How do we go from waiting for the kiss from Prince Charming to other princes? Or why do we need to have the prince save us? How does Cinderella become an entrepreneur?
Wonderful.
So it started this whole range of beyond one type of funding to multiple sources of funding at the strategy level, also at the story level. So this is all going well. However, the CEO was excited. One vice president was excited. One vice president was really angry. And I didn't know why, but she became very combative, criticizing Rob Burke and myself. And then at 3:30, I looked at her with a great deal of anxiety. I said, what's going on here? And to her credit, she understood. She was brilliant, far more smarter than any of us in the room were. I mean, she was at a different level than all of us. She goes, can't you tell? I go, no, actually, I don't know. She goes, I'm the wicked stepsister. And I just stopped. I didn't know what to do because I didn't understand. She was so much smarter than us. And she now reframed the discussion, and I just kind of said some, I just kind of, let's do the next method. And then when the project ended, the CEO and the vice president said, best thing ever, we're going to embed this in our organized strategy. And Rob Burke and I knew straight away that wasn't going to happen. The wicked stepsister, of course, was going to win. Looking back at that moment, I should have done deep breathing, become mindful, and says, no one wants to be the wicked stepsister, do they? What's a better story for you that aligns with where this organization wishes to go? Then if I had been more mindful, and now I try to be mindful in that moment. So it could have been the fairy godmother. There's whole 4 or 5 possible choices for her where she could have played in the game. And so this where I try to work a lot on the CLA of the self. If that's done well, then the organizational structure and the personal structure align. So after a normal CLA workshop, we always do the inner part. When I was in Dubai, I think I'm not sure. I think in November recently. No, it was in March this year. And we had done this CLA part, and then we were doing the inner work. And then one person said, well, actually, this is all great, but I have a family, I have a full-time job, and now I'm going to the UK to pursue a PhD. And so he wanted advice from the group. I said, okay, you've given us your problem. I guess what's the issue? The issue is I don't have time. This is really difficult for me. I have to take on more debt. I said, okay, tell me the metaphor. He goes, I'm a donkey carrying rocks. And everyone felt it in the room. I said, okay, here's one of our key leaders who feels like he's a donkey. And so then I asked the group, okay, what's a better story for him? And now they've been primed into a day of futures, right? They're thinking long term. They're thinking solutions. They're thinking transformation. And so one of them said, perhaps the stones are a foundation to the new home you're building. Perhaps they're foundations for the new home you're building. And you could see his shoulders from being tight and, he's suddenly relaxed. He goes, that's what I'm doing. So that inner work is equally important to the outer work. I know in the Mongolia case, the head of the hospital, she goes, being a head of the hospital is horrible, especially during COVID. I have to make patients, physicians, nurses, staff all happy. So my metaphor is the golden fish. I have a 10-second attention span. I'm running around the entire hospital trying to make people happy, and I'm miserable. If anything goes wrong, it's going to be me as the head of the hospital. So we took her through the CLA process, and then she said, aha, the new story is the bamboo forest. Meaning the negative energy goes through the bamboo. And she has the ability to bend, to flow. And so this changed her. So she's focused on the growth of the forest itself, not on being the goldfish.
Love that.
So she went, I think, okay, I now feel empowered. I now can help reduce gastric cancer, reduce tobacco consumption. I can now play a role in that because I'm clear about who I am. I mean, she's not going to influence the prime minister, but she's the head of her hospital. She can do a lot there. So if the structure prevents us from making a difference, CLA more and more to me move towards agency.
When you talk about the CLA for the self,
yes,
you're giving examples of where you've seen somebody being challenged in the middle of a workshop.
Yes.
And it's become apparent that actually they need to do a little bit of inner work.
Yes.
Have there been instances, or have you thought about running some of that CLA of the self prior to an organisational CLA workshop, for example, so that people are coming to a workshop perhaps more present, more aware of their selves that they carry with them?
That's a brilliant idea. I never thought of it. It never even occurred to me. I've been thinking about how to get the champions understanding their story, but your idea is prep them first through understanding the inner story work, so when they arrive, they're ready to fly. Which is great. No, I think that's fantastic. I've not done that because there's the trust making.
Yes.
Because there's the thing, do they trust me? Do I trust them? Many times people in a room don't share their story because they're nervous. Because when the stories I get from people in positions of power, they say, I'm an imposter to themselves. They said they don't believe they deserve to be there. So if they say that publicly, the CEO is going to say, you're right, you don't. There's the door. So there's a bit of safety creating. And if I can get a day for that, then I can do the CLA of the self. But I think your point, Victoria, I'm very happy. I'll try it. So I'm saying, let's do the CLA of the self first. And then we can do scenarios and visioning and strategy. I think that could also work.
Can I just ask at a really practical level, you ask someone what their metaphor is, I'm a goldfish, or someone else, I'm the donkey with the rocks. I mean, presumably that is a metaphor they arrive at after some prompting by you and, some instructing them or at least helping them to think in that sort of a way. What does that process look like, getting people outside of the black and white and the data and into that kind of metaphorical way of thinking? How do you coax them into that space practically?
So the first thing I ask is, what's the current issue they're working on? So then, but they have to do it, they write it down, it's personal. And so, for example, one person wrote, dealing with aging in my organization. Okay, great. So then I asked them, what do you say during the day? That's the litany part. We got the research question, aging in the organization. What's the research? What do you say? What's your litany? Litany could be, I'm so tired of these elderly people having all the power. I'm 32 and I have none. And so then what do you say to others around? You say, all day I rant to my fellow Gen Y, whatever it is. Okay, so now we have the litany done. And so they write that down. Then we say, okay, level 2 is the system. Where's the conflict? Because if you're okay with the current power structure and you have to wait 30 years before you can make decisions, there's no issue. In this case, he said, I know more than the others. The conflict between is the self who already believes he knows more versus the self that has to fit in. So now we have a conflict. The fitting in self, which most organizations encourage, fit in so you can do well, versus him having an expert mind and think, oh wait, I know more. So now we have a conflict, and then I go to level 3 analysis. What's the worldview? Again, it's CLA, what's the worldview? The identity question. When did you get this mindset? I was that way when I was 10, or when I started school, or when I was a teenager. I felt I was the smartest, surrounded by people who didn't know what they were doing. So now that person has an understanding of litany, the system of conflict, the worldview, and then I said, what's the metaphor? In this case, he said, I'm an iPhone in a room full of Nokias. So now he has the core metaphor, iPhone in a room full of Nokias. Now we've done that. Then we say, okay, given that that's putting you in conflict, in competition, and the Nokias aren't going to go away, what's a better story for you? And he shifted to co-design chip maker. So now, and the other group were in the room. So this took some guts. They weren't like a group that he was going to talk later. They were actually sitting here listening to him. And so then co-design chip maker, what does that mean at the worldview level? That means I accept that some people who are older have knowledge that I don't have. They may not have knowledge about cyber, climate change, new technologies, but they have knowledge that's tacit that might be useful for me. And I work with them. And then we said, okay, systemically, what do you need? He said, well, I need to have the elderly give me positions where I can fly, I can excel, I can shine. So this became his new focus. So you ask questions. What's the research question? Problem with litany, what I say over and over. System, where's the conflict in my selves, in my attitudes, in my approaches? What's the origin of this? Does this feel like something else? And level 4, what's the core metaphor underneath it? And then what's a better story?
Love that.
That's beautiful. I love it.
Now, the stuff I've been doing lately, I met someone she was doing, Deb Wilson. She was doing her PhD on polyvagal theory. And she suggested to me, well, you're doing this cognitively. Please note the body keeps score. Trauma, pain is kept at the body level. So this was quite interesting. I said, so what do you mean? She goes, well, she's a school teacher. And she goes, well, there's a pain when children come in. There's a pain there. And I try to collectively deal with that pain through storytelling, but also through movement. So sometimes kids, they need to rest, do breathing mindfulness. Sometimes you may say, go out and run for 20 minutes, and come back. So this was quite intriguing to me. So there's movement and body within the CLA process. And, that's really, I'm not a human potential expert, but I could see where she's trying to take it. And I thought that was quite interesting.
And I feel, I've been in your classes before, Sohail, and I feel like you do build in a lot of that into your teaching already. Do you feel like you're doing more of that now?
Where I can, we bring it into the game process, because this is a Foresight Future Studies course. And I want to not confuse it with the therapeutic course. It's really about, because I'm very clear. Here's what I know. Here's what works. And so it's getting clear. If I know my metaphor, I can create a better future. So it's very much about narrative futures, narrative foresight. Linking foresight not just to data, but foresight to the deeper stories we tell. And if we can retell those stories. So this is very much in the tradition of Joseph Campbell, William Irvin Thompson. And they always stress that. It's the dreaming of the different future. And of course, New Zealand, Aotearoa, in terms of the Maori contribution, would be about the dreaming, the storytelling, and linking that to Western system science. So this is now moving away from CLA as a practical method to the theory that informs CLA is very much ways of knowing theories, that we know the world in different ways. And the more of those methods and tools we can bring in to any problem, we'll have deeper, longer-term, lasting solutions.
Sohail, can you talk to me a little bit about your facilitation techniques personally and how they might have changed over the years?
My first speech would have been 1982. My professor, Jim Dater, said he was working with the Federal Credit Union. Can I please present on research I was doing? And so I started, and the CEO fell asleep. And then my second speech was I was a researcher of the Hawaii justice system. The Chief Justice was there. The other justice was there. It was a big deal for a 27, 28-year-old. And I presented, and the Chief Justice fell asleep. So, and then my third presentation was with the Hawaii Department of Labor. And I presented all the data, litany and systems, big trends. And I left the room and everyone walked away in a different direction than me. So I quickly learned being smarter in terms of data systems than the participants doesn't work. And the core idea is to find very smart people and give them methods, tools, ways of thinking so they can own it, have agency, have process, and co-create. So I've tried to make myself less and less in the room to when I need to exert authority, but generally everyone knows I'm just there to guide. So I've had to change my story from expert to guide. And it's much more fun for me. So people say, well, I don't see you getting anxious. I go, why would I get anxious? You're the smart ones. I'm just there saying, try this. There's no anxiety there.
And that's your story, that's your metaphor.
Yeah.
Guides you.
And then also now, to make sure for me during a process that I have to be clear. The areas I'm not clear about, they tend to come out in the workshop. So this is where the facilitator, which you were suggesting, at least we do work on ourselves before the workshop, before the lecture, before the project, to understand who we are in this process. And the cleaner or clearer or more mindful we can be, I think the hypothesis will be more effective.
All right, Sohail, we are going to change up the pace a little bit. We have 3 lightning round questions for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
Can you give us a quick elevator pitch for the CLA?
Go from the shallow waters to the depth.
That is very good. That is very good. What is the optimal group size and setting to run a CLA workshop?
CLA can work with 1,000 people, but 25 people, there's some sharing of ideas, sharing of self. It creates a community. 1,000 people get you a product.
Interesting. And is there a specific type of audience that gets more out of this tool than another?
Okay. I'm hesitant to answer because this brings in my judgment system. Clearly, okay, this is a critique then. How do I say it without a critique? If you live in a superficial world, then of course CLA will seem strange. Because if you live in a world where you not experience struggle or challenges, then it will be, why would you need to go deeper? I already have everything. So it's more difficult CLA if you're in a situation of personal or financial or generational privilege.
Interesting. Thank you.
Could I invite you to offer any final piece of advice you might have to a practitioner who's listening, who's been taking notes throughout this conversation and would like to have a go at this themselves?
I think, again, do the inner CLA on yourself. Who are you as a practitioner? What's your story? If now you're going to work with a client, before you start the work, understand your story in their story. What's your character in their overall story? That will lead to far more efficacy as you help them co-create and make the change.
Is this, just to clarify, is this your story in relation to the client or the group you're working with, or just in your own life and where you're at with your career or job?
I would do both. First, it's my own story, my own life. And secondly, there's a specific archetype or character. I had I've told this before, one PhD student, very successful person. And I said, so why do you want to do this? He goes, well, I'm very good at international consulting, but academia is like a desert for me. So I said, okay, so what does that mean? He said, well, I'm in a camel. I don't know where the oasis is. I said, aha, I'm the camel driver. I just have to take you to the oasis. So for 3 years, all I did, he was so smart, was to keep him focused. That's it. I didn't need to do all this other stuff, be involved in the drama. Very clear archetype. Take the camel to the water. And so I made sure his chapters were focused, precise, answering the research question. And of course, since he's so smart, he wanted to discuss 50 other topics. So in that process, I get very clear what's needed.
Sohail, this has been wonderful, a privilege to speak to you. Thank you for giving us your time. We couldn't be more grateful.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks, Jesse. Always fantastic. And see you both soon.
Well, that was our conversation with Professor Sohail Inayatullah, and fair to say, plenty to unpack.
Certainly, lots to unpack in there, lots to reflect on, lots to sit with. I think one of the biggest takeaways from that conversation for me was around the power of storytelling and metaphors and planning and decision-making as well. He talked a lot about this almost surface level reliance on data and quantitative analysis, but that in reality, it's often the stories and the metaphors that are driving decisions.
Yeah, and even the most data-driven, number-focused people, those CFOs that he spoke about, still actually, although they believed that they were just talking about numbers, their language gave them away. When they chatted to him, it was all story.
Yeah, and I think as well, his conversation made me think a lot about the role of metaphor and narrative and the role that plays in how we perhaps design into the future. So stories help us create. Our brains don't process imagined experiences any differently to those that are real experiences. So the things that we're feeling, the emotions, they activate through story, and they're genuine. They have that ability to move us into action, right? They play a super critical role in change. And I actually think just knowing that in and of itself is valuable.
Yeah, on that, wanted to mention another story he told about the power company, where things had changed so much in their industry. The old metaphor that their job was to keep the lights on as cheaply as possible no longer really was fit for purpose, and in fact was going to become increasingly unfit for purpose as that industry continued to change.
For sure. I think that's a really great example of how something like CLA or considering what your story is actually something you do on the regular as opposed to a one-off, one-time only activity. There is value. The world is changing really quickly around us, and presumably so are our stories.
I hope lots of other people listening to that today took a moment during that conversation to think, what is my metaphor? It's quite a useful thought experiment. Not an easy one to answer, but worth investing some time in. And we hope that you enjoyed that conversation in general. That was episode 3. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information you've just heard, don't worry, Victoria is here to turn it into a practical workshop. She's going to do that for you in episode 4.
I am. Good luck to us.
So thanks for listening. Episode 4 is next, our Causal Layered Analysis workshop. Last week I forgot to say thanks to the Beths, an awesome New Zealand guitar band who have supplied the music for these interview episodes. Sounds great. We love it. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, the Beths. We love you.
Catch you all next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Futures Workshop.
Ka kite. Bye.